Pierce Brosnan has spent 4 decades playing men who stay composed while the world falls apart around them. On screen, that composure looks effortless. Off-screen, it was built the hard way, out of a childhood spent waiting for people to come back, and an adult life spent burying 2 of the women he loved most to the same disease. At 73, with a new season of television on the way and paintbrushes still within reach, Brosnan carries all of it at once. The boy who slept behind a newspaper-covered curtain, the actor who lost James Bond before he ever got to play him, the husband who held his wife's hand as she died, and the father who did it again, 22 years later, for his daughter. Pierce Brendan Brosnan was born on May 16, 1953, in Drogheda, County Louth, Ireland. The only child of Thomas Brosnan, a carpenter, and May Smith, a young nurse. His father left the family when Pierce was still an infant, and the 2 barely knew each other. They would not properly meet again until Brosnan was in his 30s, filming in Ireland. And even then his father felt like a stranger. When Pierce was 4, his mother made the decision that would define his childhood. She moved to London to train as a nurse, hoping to build a better life for both of them. She could only afford to come home once or twice a year. In the meantime, Pierce was raised by his maternal grandparents in Navan, County Meath. When they died, he was passed between an aunt, an uncle, and finally a boarding house run by a woman named Eileen Riley, where he shared a room with adult lodgers and slept behind a curtain pinned with newspaper to keep out the light. Brosnan has never described that period as bleak. He has spoken warmly of Eileen, of the other children he played with, of a town that, despite the loneliness, gave him a kind of freedom. But he has also been honest about the cost of it. He grew up, in his own words, feeling like an outsider on the edge of town, aware from an early age that his family looked different from the ones around him in Catholic Ireland in the 1950s. He has called his mother's decision to leave for London a courageous one, made out of necessity rather than choice. But a child does not always experience necessity the way an adult explains it later. What he carried forward from those years was not bitterness toward his mother, but a lasting sensitivity to absence, and to the people who choose, again and again, to stay. In 1964, at 11 years old, Brosnan left Ireland to join his mother in London, where she had remarried a man named William Carmichael. The move gave him, for the first time, something like a stable household. It also gave him his first real brush with a character that would eventually define his career. Soon after arriving in Britain, the family took him to see Sean Connery in Goldfinger. He has described the vivid image of Connery's Bond, controlled and untouchable on screen, as something that stayed with him long after the lights came up. At school, classmates mocked his Irish accent, and Brosnan later said he made a deliberate choice to own his identity rather than let it be used against him. He left school at 16 with a portfolio of drawings and began training in commercial illustration at St. Martin's School of Art, assuming his future lay in painting rather than performing. Acting arrived almost by accident, through an experimental theater workshop that introduced him to movement, mime, and improvisation. Something about the discipline of it held him, and he went on to train for 3 years at the Drama Centre London, graduating in 1975. The years that followed were not glamorous. He worked as an assistant stage manager at the Theatre Royal in York, took small parts, and slowly built a reputation. In 1977, playwright Tennessee Williams personally selected him to play the lead in a London production of The Red Devil Battery Sign, a vote of confidence that helped move him from regional theater toward bigger stages, and eventually television and film. Small film roles followed in the early 1980s, including brief appearances in The Mirror Cracked and The Long Good Friday, before American television gave him his breakthrough. In 1982, Brosnan was cast as the charming con man at the center of NBC's Remington Steele, a role that combined the wit, elegance, and controlled danger audiences would later associate with a very different character. It was Remington Steele, ironically, that both opened the door to James Bond and slammed it shut. In 1986, with Roger Moore stepping away from a role after 7 films, Brosnan was the producer's choice to become the 5th actor to play 007. Around the same time, NBC canceled Remington Steele after 4 seasons. But the publicity around Brosnan's possible casting as Bond drove ratings for the canceled show's reruns so high that NBC reversed course and revived it. invoking a contractual option to bring Brosnan back for a fifth season. Bond producer Albert Cubby, Broccoli reportedly did not want his new leading man appearing in a competing spy role on television while a Bond film was in theaters, and the deal collapsed. Timothy Dalton was cast instead. Brosnan later described losing the role as a genuine blow, one that came without any public ceremony or explanation. Just a phone call ending 8 years of quiet hope. Those who worked with him at the time recalled that he was devastated but never bitter, and that he kept working rather than dwelling on it. The years between that loss and Bond finally becoming his in 1994 were not empty ones professionally. Brosnan took on a wider range of roles, working opposite Michael Caine in the Cold War thriller The Fourth Protocol, and stepping into one of America's best-loved family comedies as Robin Williams' rival in Mrs. Doubtfire. But those same years also carried the heaviest private loss of his life. In 1987, while filming in India, his wife Cassandra Harris began feeling unusually tired, and doctors in London found ovarian cancer. Brosnan had met Cassandra, an Australian-born actress who had appeared alongside Roger Moore in For Your Eyes Only, in London in the mid-1970s. She came with 2 young children, Charlotte and Christopher, from a previous marriage, and Brosnan built a family life with all 3 long before he and Cassandra formally married in 1980. After the death of the children's biological father, Dermot Harris, in 1986, Brosnan adopted Charlotte and Christopher, and they took his name. The couple's son, Sean, was born in 1983. Cassandra's illness reshaped the family's daily life for 4 years. She underwent 8 operations and roughly 18 months of chemotherapy, questioning her doctors, making her own decisions, and continuing to direct the household whenever her strength allowed it. Brosnan later described himself as a quieter presence beside her, there for every appointment and every uncertain result, while their young son Sean, too small to understand fully, would sometimes pretend to be his mother's doctor after her treatments left her exhausted. Friends who visited the family's Malibu home during that period remembered a household that refused to let illness define every hour. Children still swam in the pool, ordinary routines continued, and Cassandra herself, only days removed from chemotherapy, still walked the grounds of a property the couple was considering buying. As her condition worsened, Brosnan has said he never directly asked her whether she was afraid, a decision he later came to regret because her outward determination had made it easy to believe she would keep fighting. In the final days at the hospital, a priest left religious passages for the family, and Brosnan tried to read aloud at her bedside but found himself unable to keep the words in order. Cassandra Harris died on December 28, 1991, at the age of 43, one day after the couple's 11th wedding anniversary. Brosnan later told an interviewer that from the very first diagnosis, the family understood they were in a real fight, not dealing with something minor. Christopher was 19 when his mother died, and Brosnan later said he could see both the pain and the absence in his son's eyes. Charlotte was already an adult with children of her own on the way, and Sean, still a young boy, had to be told by his father that afternoon that his mother was gone. Brosnan sought counseling for himself and for Sean, allowed his children to see him grieve openly, and tried in the months afterward to structure his work so that he could be home in the mornings and evenings. 3 years after Cassandra's death, Brosnan met Keely Smith, an American television correspondent, at a party in Cabo San Lucas, Mexico, in April 1994. Their first date lasted until 3 in the morning, and the relationship developed steadily rather than dramatically. Smith brought her own career and causes into their partnership. She had reported on environmental issues and would go on to work as a documentary filmmaker and advocate, later co-directing a film exposing environmental damage in Hawaii. The couple worked together over the years on conservation campaigns, including efforts to protect a gray whale nursery in Mexico's Laguna San Ignacio from an industrial salt operation, and to oppose a proposed natural gas facility off the California coast. Their first son, Dylan, was born in January 1997, and their second, Paris, in February 2001. That August, Brosnan and Smith married at Ballintubber Abbey in County Mayo, Ireland, with the couple's blended family gathered around them. Brosnan has since spoken about their marriage in unglamorous, practical terms, describing it as the accumulated result of solving problems together year after year, rather than any single act of rescue. Smith has echoed that sentiment, describing the foundation of their relationship simply as friendship. GoldenEye finally brought Brosnan the role that had slipped away nearly a decade earlier, arriving in 1995 after a 6-year gap in the Bond series. The film became an international success, earning more than $350 million worldwide and re-establishing the franchise for a new generation. Brosnan went on to play Bond in 3 more films: Tomorrow Never Dies, The World Is Not Enough, and Die Another Day, before his tenure ended in 2004, much as his path to the role had once been interrupted with an unexpected phone call. While filming After the Sunset in the Bahamas, his agents informed him that negotiations for a 5th film had broken down, and producers Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson confirmed the series was moving in a different direction. Brosnan has said the ending left him with a sense of unfinished business, but he did not let it define the rest of his career. He returned to riskier, less polished roles, playing a burnt-out, morally compromised assassin in The Matador, a performance that earned him a Golden Globe nomination and proved he could carry damage and dark humor as convincingly as he had once carried Bond's control. Even as his professional life moved forward, the disease that took Cassandra had not finished with the family. Charlotte, whom Brosnan had adopted as a child and who had grown into what he called one of the warmest voices in the family, built her own life with her partner, Alex Smith, and their 2 children, Isabella and Lucas. She had watched ovarian cancer take her mother in 1991, and in the years that followed, doctors kept a close watch on her because of the family history. Nearly 2 decades later, she received the same diagnosis her mother once had. Charlotte underwent treatment for 3 years while continuing to live as fully as she could, as a partner, a mother, a daughter, and a sister. In June 2013, with time clearly running short, she married Alex, the man she had already spent years raising a family with, in a ceremony that brought the household together one more time before hospital routines took over completely. On June 28, 2013, Charlotte died in London at the age of 41, surrounded by her husband, her 2 children, and her brothers Christopher and Sean. Brosnan's public statement was brief. He called her his darling daughter, said she had fought her illness with grace and dignity, and asked people to pray for a cure. The following year, speaking at a Stand Up to Cancer broadcast, he spoke publicly about having held the hand of both his wife and his daughter as ovarian cancer took each of them in turn, a repetition that needed no further explanation. Brosnan's family bonds have not all healed easily or on a predictable schedule. Christopher, who had trained in screenwriting and worked behind the camera on several of his father's productions, including 3 of the Bond films, struggled for years with addiction to alcohol, cocaine, and heroin, including a near-fatal overdose and a later arrest for heroin possession. By 2005, Brosnan had reached what he described as a necessary boundary, telling an interviewer that his son was still very lost, and that all he could do was hold on to faith that Christopher would find his own way out, because no one else could do it for him. The distance between them lasted, by most accounts, close to 20 years. Brosnan continued to name Christopher among his children in public messages, including a 2022 Father's Day post addressed to all 4 of his sons. In November 2025, Brosnan, Christopher, and Dylan were photographed together leaving a family dinner in London's Notting Hill neighborhood, an image that offered no guarantee that every old wound had closed, but suggested that the door between father and son, even after 2 decades, had never been permanently locked. Brosnan's relationship with fame itself has always been complicated by how early it arrived and how long it took to pay off. Remington Steele ran for 5 seasons between 1982 and 1987, and it did more than launch his American career. It effectively wrote the audition he would later use to prove he could be Bond, tailored suits and all, years before Broccoli's production actually cast him. When the show's final season was ordered as a shortened run of movie-length episodes rather than a full slate, insiders at the time understood it as a kind of consolation prize, a way for NBC to wring value out of Brosnan's near-miss with 007, even as it kept him from taking the role. Brosnan rarely discussed the loss publicly in detail, in part because he and Dalton were friendly, and he did not want his disappointment to read as a slight against the man who got the part instead. Instead, he let the work speak. A Diet Coke commercial campaign built around a debonair, tuxedoed character that critics openly compared to Bond, and a string of television and film roles that kept his name in circulation until the door finally opened again in 1994. The announcement that Brosnan would become the fifth Bond traveled faster than any film could. He was introduced to the press on June 7, 1994, and within days, while shooting Robinson Crusoe in a remote part of Papua New Guinea, local children who had heard the news over the radio ran up to him, shouting his new character's name, even though no footage of him as Bond yet existed anywhere in the world. It was an early sign of just how much cultural weight the role still carried, Cold War or no Cold War, franchise fatigue or no franchise fatigue. Judi Dench's arrival as a new, more skeptical M. in Golden Eye gave Brosnan's Bond a foil that forced the character to justify himself in a way earlier films rarely had, and audiences responded. The film's commercial success was, at the time, the strongest opening the series had ever produced, restoring a franchise that had gone quiet for 6 years. Life with Keely, meanwhile, grew around causes as much as around family milestones. Beyond their shared environmental advocacy, Smith went on to build her own career as a correspondent for programs including Entertainment Tonight and The Today Show before turning toward documentary filmmaking. And Brosnan has often credited her with keeping their household oriented outward, toward causes bigger than either of their individual careers. Their sons grew up between Malibu and Hawaii, close to the coastlines their parents spent years trying to protect, and both have gone on to build creative lives of their own, working as models, filmmakers, and, in Paris's case, an environmental advocate in his own right. When Charlotte died in 2013, Brosnan has said Keely's role in the family was never to replace what had been lost, but simply to remain steadily present alongside a grief that belonged to a part of his life she had never been part of causing or curing. That distinction between love that arrives later in life and grief that predates it is one Brosnan has returned to repeatedly when asked about his marriage. The two, he has suggested, were never in competition. Now 73, Brosnan remains visibly active rather than retired. He continues to act, recently appearing in Guy Ritchie's crime drama Mobland alongside Tom Hardy and Helen Mirren, with a second season due later this year. And he continues to paint, a habit that dates back to the years he spent quietly working with his hands while Cassandra was ill. Since 2001, he has served as an ambassador for UNICEF Ireland, and he and Keely have continued to support ovarian cancer research in the years since Charlotte's death. Around him now are Keely, for surviving children, grandchildren, and a body of work that spans tuxedos, comedies, and troubled men far removed from either. Cassandra and Charlotte are still named when he speaks about his life, not as wounds he has hidden, but as people who remain part of the family's ongoing story. As a boy, Brosnan once described his grandfather simply as the hand he held. Decades later, he held Cassandra's hand, and then Charlotte's, through the hardest moments either of them faced. That image, more than any tuxedo or any franchise, is the through line of his life, a man who spent his childhood learning what it felt like when people left, and who spent his adulthood choosing, over and over, to stay.